yourselves, perhaps. So we've got Tim from R3, Mary from IBM, and Russell representing Consensus and the Enterprise Ethereum crowd. So maybe just
Sure. So apart from having a photograph that makes it look like I stumbled through a hedge, apparently, so we'll fix that in the future state. So yeah, I'm with R3. I think it's actually very cool to have Ethereum and IBM and R3 here, because I think at the moment, as of today, people would argue that that we're the most likely large-scale winners in this, but there's a lot of other players out there as well, of course. But so R3, we've been around for a couple of years. We've kind of gone from zero to this week was a big week for us. Some of you may have seen we've raised money from 44 global financial institutions, so we're now capitalized, and R3's goal is to redefine the foundations of finance by the power of collaborative networks. So what does that mean? That means we're pulling the network together of players in the financial services ecosystem. That's our very clear and sole focus. And our goal is to determine how and when this technology can be deployed in financial services, and that's been an 18-month, 2-year journey so far. And what we've built as a result of working with that community is something called Corda. Corda is an open source platform, but we're now going to be building the enterprise layer, as everybody's realizing that large global regulated financial institutions are going to need enterprise software. That's the name of the game. So we're in that game now as well. And so we will be now focusing very much on continuing to build that network, that ecosystem, but also the technology itself. So that's a quick version of R3.
Great. And hi, I'm Marie Wieck. I'm the general manager of our blockchain unit in IBM, a newly formed division focusing on industry use cases broadly, not just financial services, not just payments. And we have been very heavily invested in the Linux Foundation Hyperledger Fabric as part of the stack, but the whole notion of global interoperability of multiple networks across multiple industries and the power being in the network is really what we're all about. So interoperability, standards, open source, open innovation is a really important part of what we are looking to help clients with across the board. And we've seen a lot of very interesting use cases now across 400 different clients that we've been working with. We have 9 networks that are in production with clients, and really trying to make sure that that innovation for an enterprise level is there. And I've been in technology longer than I think the rest of our panel here. But I have not. I was in our initial internet division in the early days of e-business, and I haven't seen this much interest and draw from all sectors as I have since then. And I've worked on mobile, I've worked on web services and APIs and open standards. There is definitely a change happening here as a result of some of the new capabilities that are able to establish trust and transparency across multiple participants that blockchain affords.
Great. Russell?
Hi, Russell Verbeeten from Consensus. And we're a founding member of the Enterprise Ethereum Alliance. So Consensus kind of half doing consulting for Fortune 500s and governments, and the other half is building companies on the Ethereum stack. So components that will interoperate, a lot of those get deployed for our customers on the enterprise side. And we're excited about the Enterprise Ethereum Alliance, which is a standards body. It's looking to define standards up and down the stack on the Ethereum stack for permissioned Ethereum networks. So that's at the protocol layer where you want something like pluggable consensus, all the way up to industry-specific use case standards for smart contracts that would eventually allow more seamless interoperation.
So maybe to kind of build on the intros then, I think it's kind of interesting we're even kind of sitting in this order, because I think there's probably a spectrum of blockchains out there and distributed ledgers. And on one end, there's the concept, the more traditional concept of blockchain, which is the replicated database, where everybody has that same data set. So intuitively, people think about Ethereum when you think about that, and I could be wrong, but I think maybe that's the dialogue I'd like to engage in here. So, Quora has been described as blockchain inspired, whereas, Ethereum might be on the other end. It's a pure blockchain chain architecture in the traditional sense, and the data is replicated everywhere. So maybe if you could do the elevator pitch for why your approach to this technology is the preferred one for an enterprise-grade financial services platform. So maybe I'll start with you, Russell. And
okay. I'll set the tone.
Yeah. Put the gloves on. Let's go.
So I think Ethereum has the developer community, and that's important. Eventually, the network effects are going to form, and how those network effects form is really going to be how much development there is in bringing existing and new infrastructure onto a network. Ethereum's developer community is particularly important to keep in mind. The tool sets that exist are very useful and help you be productive. So I think that's a big plus for Ethereum right now. And then, of course, the Enterprise Ethereum Alliance grew up about this need for, or this demand within the enterprise market that we're all servicing. But the public network is kind of battle testing the Ethereum stack. And so that's another big plus for Ethereum right now. We're kind of, one of the two major public networks in terms of market capitalization. There's obviously Bitcoin, which is in the $30 to $40 billion market cap range, and now Ethereum, which has seen tremendous growth since its launch 18 months ago, getting between, I think it's 18 billion or so right now.
So from an IBM perspective, like many, and I agree with the point on the developer community, if you weren't specifically interested in Bitcoin directly, and from an IBM perspective, the enterprise use cases that we saw both within our company and in our customers was really not about cryptocurrency. It was really about that distributed ledger capability. We, like almost everybody else, started with Ethereum. So we actually started our internal projects about 2 years ago on Ethereum, and there were a couple of reasons why we decided we needed a different approach. One was the licensing model with GPL. We were concerned about how open and how reusable in enterprise-grade systems that could actually apply. And the other was really the anonymous nature, that in a trusted transaction between businesses, they want to know the participants. There are really good use cases. We were talking earlier about charitable situations and other use cases where you really do want an anonymous network, but in most business contexts around network implementations, that notion of a permissioned opportunity is one that we think is pretty important. So we got together with a bunch of other folks and in particular went to the Linux Foundation, really strong track record of open source governance. And jointly we were a premier member of some of the original founders of the Hyperledger project. That project has now grown to include 8 different projects within it, focusing on innovation in blockchain solutions, now has over 140 members. So it's grown over 350% in just the 15 months since it's been there, and is really getting a lot of traction and really focusing on enterprise class opportunities. We do want innovation from all sorts. So the latest version 1 of Hyperledger Fabric is just one of the projects, you know, has modularity and pluggability built in. You can plug different databases. You can plug different consensus algorithms. You can have different trust models. How do you really get the point where wherever you're starting from, you can engage in an enterprise-grade, enterprise-class solution, and then focus on interoperability? And we've seen projects like everyone else almost across every industry, but the majority has been in the financial services sector. You know, Gartner just did a recent update looking at pilot projects, and I think 75% were in financial services. But I would say a lot of those are what I would describe as blockchain tourism. They are sightseeing. They are prototyping. They are kicking the tires. And I think we're starting to see a shift this year in moving from sightseeing to starting to decide which neighborhood they move into and really getting into, you know, that production use case of how are we going to not just try all the different flavors, but really get engagement. And I think some of the interoperability and integration between those projects are ones that are going to be critical. And, you know, we're working at DTCC with R3, with Axoni. You know, there's a lot of cases where we're working with multiple players in the blockchain space, because at the end, what you really want is the business value of that network and what it's providing in terms of its member benefits, not the technology stack itself.
So can I do a little poll to find out who's in the room before I answer my answer? So who would consider themselves sufficiently up to speed on blockchain and DLT that you're here to listen to the nuances of what the three of us are saying because you know who we are, and who's at that point? All right, about third. Who is really relatively new to the space and you're kind of here to kind of get a start and sort of feel about what the hell all the hype's about? All right, so it's a pretty even split. So I'm going to appeal to the second half of those people first. Why? Why the fuss? Well, because this is going to be dramatic and profound, ladies and gentlemen. Why is this going to be dramatic and profound? Well, because the internet, and Marie, I think it's a very important statement that Marie made, which is that there hasn't been buzz like this with people in the know, and those of you who put your hands up in the first half know what I'm talking about, since the internet. So why? Well, the internet was dramatic and profound in the way that it changed the world for all of us as individuals and as companies, but it didn't do two important things. It changed the way we exchange data. It flattened the communication layer, profound. Arguably the swan song of the third industrial revolution. The fourth industrial revolution starts with, can we process data in a consistent way, shared processing logic, and can we actually generate truth? Can we generate facts that are immutable and therefore not have to keep checking whether we're aware of the same facts? Now that change is going to be at least as profound as the internet was in terms of its change. So that's why, and this is no longer, I think at this point, because you've kind of got a bit, we're representing all the constituencies here. You've got Ethereum, which grew up from a grassroots community of extremely smart people who built an extremely powerful machine, a world computer as they call it, and that spawned a very significant community of users, and that's the kind of the new way. You've got IBM, the incumbent, who's putting significant resources into this. The number is eye-popping if you hear the number of people that Marie's got working on this at IBM. It's a lot of people, it's a lot of resources. And then you've got R3, which is kind of somewhere in the middle, owned by the financial services community, but a groovy startup nevertheless. So you've kind of got all the constituents here, right? So how do we approach it? And so now to answer Andrew's question, how have we approached it differently? Well, I was going to tell you our approach, and they were different, right? They're all different, and they're all valid, and the network of networks comment is the most important thing. We're all going to have to work together in the end, so let's not get like into a battle of Netscape versus, you know, something else. That's not what this is about. Our threes approach was, let's get the financial services sector in the room. Let's get the ecosystem together. Let's get the regulators and central banks and the industry associations and a global community of banks and asset managers or insurance companies, etc., exchanges, and then let's figure out from them what they want to build. That was our approach. And so we went from evaluating the technology to building the technology, and the core element of the technology that we built from the ground up was the privacy model had to be that the data only goes to the people that need to have the data. Because the model that Bitcoin started, and it's an extraordinary model, should win a Nobel Prize, it does not work for regulated financial services. You can't send all the data to all the nodes, as Andrew suggested. It's just not practical, not the answer, legally impossible. Most jurisdictions won't allow it. So you need to have a model where you just share the data with the people that need to know the data, be that the people in the transaction, or a regulatory or central banking or supervisory body. And that's the core design feature from the ground up that we built. And so everything in Corda is really around that idea. And therefore, we didn't build a blockchain, because arguably the need to group transactions into blocks and assure that through consensus mechanisms that they're valid transactions and assure their immutability is born of the need to do trustless, permissionless, anonymous exchange of digital value, which was Bitcoin's solution, but you don't need that in financial services. So we've built something that removes the need to have blocks and chains, but it is nevertheless the superset of distributed ledgers that's the most significant term, hence the term here, and we've built something that's aside to that. And I think you'll see now that a lot of the efforts that are going on are all moving to try and solve that privacy and that data model issue. It just so happens that we started from that, and that's, I think, the distinction from our architecture. Sorry, that was a bit of a long-winded answer.
Are you done, or is there anything else? Okay, no. No, that was great. Exactly the dialogue I was looking for, and I think we alluded to, you know, Marie, you said, you know, you're starting to sort of move out of the POC phase, and I know Tim and I have talked about this in the past. We ourselves have done POCs, right? Today, Greg Wolfen from SecureKey was on stage talking about a really compelling identity use case that they've been obviously working with IBM on and Hyperledger. What else are you guys seeing? So let's stay in the financial services arena, and maybe if you could talk about where you think this technology, broadly speaking, is gaining some traction. And then my second question, I'm just going to combine them in the interest of time, is also around, you know, we've also heard about, okay, this could be more efficient and save us some money. Okay, so yes, maybe, but is that really what this is about, or is this about looking for truly new ways of doing business, and is there a transformative aspect to it? And again, linking it back to what are those use cases? Are they greenfield? You know, perhaps the identity use case is somewhat greenfield because it's a bit of a mess right now, whereas this can actually help glue things together that don't have literally, you're not replacing anything per se. Or in a high-value payments case, there is an incumbent technology that does work, and you know, traditional client-server architectures. So that's more of a replacement kind of scenario. So I'm just, you know, if we could kind of bat that idea around, and maybe start with you, Marie.
Sure. And so what we're seeing, especially in the financial services space, and I would agree wholeheartedly, even on, you know, having the trust model include a focused element on who gets to see what data. And in Hyperledger Fabric version 1, you know, in the details, the channels actually provide that. So there is a notion of a channel, just like on a CB radio, that only the people that are on channel 18 can hear this part of the conversation. And you pick who's on that channel and who has permissioned access. That kind of notion that says everybody on the chain doesn't all have to have a copy of the ledger means that we're seeing transaction volumes, combination of the protocol and the blockchain technology with our implementation on a high security business network of thousands of transactions a second. That opens up a lot of really interesting use cases in financial services. That said, I would never use blockchain for the transaction itself. We think blockchain, like the internet changed information, is going to change business processes and transactions, but you're not going to do it for the trade. You're not going to do it for the sub-microsecond stock exchange trade or the credit card transaction approval. That's not where blockchain is. But everything around it, so the extension for what you do with post-settlement, the extension for what you do with other aspects of the processes around those transactions, perfect use cases because there's always multi-party and there's always the need for trust and visibility. And we did a survey of our financial services top clients around the world earlier this year, and a lot of use cases, long tail of many, many different use cases. The top 5 were trade finance. I mean, trade finance in every single institution, that was a focus area of how do you get friction out of that supply chain and encourage growth in GDP. Payments was the second. Mortgage, lending, origination, those kinds of processes, again, where there's usually somebody acting as almost a broker, as a trust authority because the trust isn't implicit in the network, are the kinds of things we're seeing. But the range, you know, from DTCC or the Japanese Stock Exchange are interesting, but Northern Trust is a different great example, focusing on the private equity markets with a implementation in Guernsey, and they brought in the regulator right up front. In our design thinking workshops, in the structure of it, the fact that now the regulator has the ability to see the data on the appropriate channel at the same time, you know, they were featured and put a quote in the press release when we announced it. We got more feedback on the fact that there was an auditor saying something positive, not doing an investigation in the press release than we did about the actual solution, which actually takes an awful lot of friction out of the system. You know, so whether it's trade finance, whether it's private equity exchange, whether it's settlements, whether it's cross-border payment mechanisms, all of which are seeing really good benefit in financial services, wherever there's multi-party, there's an opportunity.
So do you have any comments on that?
Yeah, I mean, great answer. You know, I'm not actually a financial services person, and so you know, I'm a technologist, and my answer is going to be perhaps better suited to the second question. I mean, I think what I would wager and what I have seen in enterprises is that you know, it is about efficiency at first, and we're talking about production systems. In the same way, you know, we'll make the analogy, and for the new to blockchain people in the room, this may be the first time you've heard it, but everyone else has heard it already. Where you know, when the internet was born in the early 90s, you had, you know, you know, everyone's, this is going to be great, it's going to transform business, we're going to sell books and then transform the world through logistic robots, right? But first, let's put a server in the basement and just like organize our company a little better. And that's kind of where we're at right now. And in that setting where, you know, you've got a large enterprise with a permission or even private chain, you know, you'll, I think, aspects of just kind of data integrity across different repositories is something that will add a lot of usefulness to you, and it really speaks to that regulatory use case that you brought up. Longer term, we are talking about global networks, and in that setting, I can't even remember the question, Andrew, but in that in that setting, we're really talking about like new types of value emerging from network effects in the technology stack. And that's kind of new. You know, when we think about network effects, you know, you could think about people reference like Facebook, and you know, you talk about the number of users, and because everyone in theory can talk to every other person, then you know, you at some point you get a critical mass of users, and then like an exponential rise in value. So the description goes. On blockchain networks, every service that comes on the network has the possibility to talk to every other service. So when a new service comes on, it can make the other services stronger, and at some point, you know, ultimately it goes back to users, but at some point you get a critical mass of kind of functionality. And then what we're going to see, because we're talking about kind of open source shared digital infrastructure, or at least shared digital infrastructure, portions of it will be open source. My sense is that most of it will be eventually, but you know, you're going to see new types of markets emerge that sit on top of this interoperation, and that is something that you know, first we got to put the server in the basement and hire, you know, someone to run it.
So I'd like to also give you a chance, but we're just in the interest of time. So I think building on what you just said, you know, if we have this universe of applications emerging on these networks, how can we tie this back into that regulatory conversation? Because some of these applications live in highly regulated spaces. So I know you guys have been spending a lot of time talking to regulators, so maybe if you could, you know, talk about the approach to working with regulators and how all of this is magically going to come together in a regulated fashion.
Yeah, it's and by the way, I agree with exactly what my colleagues have said here. So you've kind of got the right answers, I think, to those questions. But there is that crucial part of why are two guys in a garage in Silicon Valley not about to entirely upend and disrupt the entire financial services game, and why haven't they done that already? And it's because it's highly regulated, right? That's why. So you can't do Uber and you can't do Airbnb in financial services because you'll go to jail instead of getting a rap across the knuckles, which Uber and Airbnb are still getting on a regular basis from people around the world. Yeah, just don't do it again, right? You'll go to jail, right? So the importance, and Marie touched on it as well, like the importance of bringing in the regulators and the central banks and the governance component from day one is massive. So we, in what I think turned out to be a prescient move, we just went on a world tour of regulators and central banks from when we started, and so we've met over 100 now. But most notably, and this is let's get stuck into some meat here because there's some news floating around this week which is very relevant to this very discussion. So let's get stuck into it. You probably read it. It's very relevant to the people in this room. So as everybody knows, we've been doing a proof of concept of doing work with the Bank of Canada and Payments Canada over the last year. It's been really great to work with them, and of course the important thing is we've got the commercial banks and the regulators and the payments operator all in the same room thinking about how do we represent fiat currency on the ledger and enable a payments network with this digital representation of fiat currency. That's the gist of it. Now, it's amazing that we got everyone together and we're doing the right level of thinking, but we've also heard this week that the statement is, well, DLT is not necessarily going to create the kind of efficiencies in mutualization of infrastructure for large value payment systems that would really, in my words, set the net present value of transition to positive, which is going to make your institution spend millions of dollars to get to a new state because it's not worth it for that. And this gets to your question about, is it operational efficiency or new business? The real story in there is not that DLT is not ready, because every one of us here we've got work to do to put together the enterprise layer. It's not just there and ready today. No one should imply that it's just all there today. Scalability, security, privacy, in various ways in different platforms, still have a lot of work to do. But they are sufficiently far now to move out of POC zone and kill the POC. No more proof of concept, please. No more time for it. It's a waste of everybody's time. We've got to get beyond research and experimentation and start to get to production. So the real story in the Bank of Canada and Payments Canada and the story this week is that what you get if you can input this stuff, and if you read what was actually in the press release and not what was highlighted by the press who love to pick up the negative stuff, it's that the benefits of putting this sort of framework into a payment system you get when you build stuff on top. That's where you start to see the kind of new ways of doing business that frankly nobody in this room can think of yet, because nobody could have thought of them 25 years ago when the internet boom started. But we have to move towards that end state where we see these new ways of doing business. So what is the really interesting part, the thought experiment is, what is in 20 years' time when the next generation of technology comes along and there's a whole new set of conferences going on and we've all retired, right? What will they be talking about then? About what the follow-on from the internet did. What did blockchain actually do? And it won't be, well, it cut a bunch of costs out of the payment system. It won't be that it kind of allowed us to put trade finance out of the dark ages and into the kicking and screaming into the 21st century. They're the starting points for a revolution, and it is a revolution and a paradigm shift that will materially change, I agree with Marie, the way that we do business, the way that we architect systems, the way that we govern, the way that we regulate. That's not really in it. I think for the people who are in the space, we might be drinking our own Kool-Aid, but it's not really in question anymore. This is the way it's going to pan out. So the big question is, how do we make it real? You've got to crash through the proof of concept. You've got to get in the game. You've got to put resources onto it. And you've got to start building stuff. That's the only way to do it. And I think all three firms represented here are singularly focused on building stuff now. Proof of concept is dead. You heard it here first.
Yeah, I mean,
if I could just add on to that,
Please,
you know, 400 engagements so far with clients around the world. It's not the technology. It is not that, you know, distributed ledger technologies don't work for this solution. It is the business model where we're seeing the most discussion. And we just launched an accelerator program last week, which includes code assets of, here are common building blocks we're seeing in every one of these blockchain networks on workflow, on visibility, on provenance, on core components. But the other half is all about how do we help founders of networks, how do we get them to a tipping point of onboarding network participants, because the power is in the network. And it is the business model, especially when it's a consortium-led approach, of who has control. You know, we talked about what is the management of a network. Who has control, both business-wise, technology-wise? Who establishes the rights? If it's not a founder-led network where you own that specifically for your supply chain and is something where you want broader interoperability across multiple people in the same industry, payments being a very good example, you need to have some governance model, some rules, some engagement approach of how do you get that business model going. And there's lots of real savings. Our own blockchain networks we've done in our global financing business has seen real payback in terms of savings on tied up capital by reducing disputes and other things. But you know, now if you're going to have multiple different payment rails in effect on multiple different technologies, and there are, I think the real benefit is now how do you get interoperability of those and how do you support those as pluggable elements into these networks?
Yeah, further on that point, I mean, if you know, the analogy to the internet, this is the next phase of the internet. We've all recognized that. And if you were a media company sitting in this conference in 1993 or the same one, and our doppelgangers were there having the same conversation, you know, things are going to shift. And the business models are going to be built on open systems. At first, you're going to see significant savings because of the efficiencies that it's going to bring to your internal operations. But eventually, as financial service industries, like we don't need to beat around the bush, Your business models will change, and they will have to change. This is going to happen across the board, everywhere where you have silos of information that businesses are built on top of. That is no longer sustainable, and the technology will push people out of the market who aren't responding to the new paradigm that's emerging. And that's something that, you know, if you're sitting down with a financial services player, which I don't do too often, right? I'm a technologist, but when I do, I have to say, look, these are the facts on the ground, and how are you going to respond? How are you going to future-proof your business? And you know, yeah, we should move on from the POC, but POC is a good starting point. And although we don't have final settlement of assets or payments on chain yet, you know, 10, 20 years, it's going to be infrastructure that's basically on chain or existing kind of above the chain, things that will basically de facto do that. So, you know, just because you can settle a 4x fiat transfer today, that will not be, you know, that won't be sustainable long term. Absolutely not.
All right, so we've only got a few minutes left, but I'd like to open it up for questions. There's a few microphones in the audience, and I know there's a few people out there who are steeped in this space and probably have a few good questions to throw at us, I hope. So, got three. Oh, no, now we have 8 minutes, so that's much more than I thought. Anyone, any takers? Oh, surprisingly not.
Ask an awkward question if you like.
Yeah. I mean, so until someone takes that, then I guess the last piece that we've started to touch on is really around standards and interoperability, and I think, Marie, you brought that up. When is the appropriate time to really start that conversation? Is it now, or is it too early? You know, that's the framing of standards.
Yeah, that's a big one. Oh, someone's got a question.
Okay, there we go.
Want to give it a shot?
I can let you answer first, though. The way I've been looking at multiple distributed ledgers is, in terms of interoperability, I've been thinking of horizontal interoperability for transactions this way, and vertical interoperability where you can use a block as a bud for another distributed ledger for identity. And I don't know if that horizontal for transactions and vertical for identity makes sense to you. I'm not deep enough into it to know if that actually makes sense. Is it a reasonable perception?
I mean, I'll take a shot. The discussion and the work that we've been doing jointly with Secure Key on trusted identity, and even in some of the projects around Hyperledger, identity is something that crosses multiple networks. And when I hear vertical versus horizontal, I usually think of vertical in an industry context around, you know, a specific payment solution, around a specific supply chain solution or healthcare solution. Identity crosses that. And I think of it more as the horizontal and the transactional element. And in the work that we've been doing to make it easier and faster to develop these solutions with that accelerator, we found there are 3 key things that you have to know. You have to know what the asset is that you're concerned about on the network. You have to know who the members are that can operate on those assets. And you have to know what the transaction type is. You know, that what is the smart contract you're going to actually use to transfer one of those assets. And every time you touch a member or an asset, you have to have identity in that in order to know whether they've got permission, whether they're in the right channel. And it's really, really beneficial if, when you go from the supply chain solution to the trade finance solution in 2 different networks, that your identity can be shared across those and that you can seamlessly interoperate. So I think of transactions actually happening within a network vertically, usually. Yes, they may be cross-border, yes, they may be between different parties, but they're usually about a given topic. But the identity of you may be an operator in many networks. You may, as a consumer or as a business person, just like in the internet and intranet, you may have different roles. You would like that to extend across broadly.
So just let me clarify, when I said vertical, what I really mean is nested hierarchies, but when I say nested hierarchy, because a lot of people don't know what I mean or I have to take some time to think. So what I mean is one distributed ledger used for identity using a block off another one as its initial proof. And then so if it's a nested hierarchy, then that's a different way of considering interoperability from the transaction interoperability, it seems to me.
And when you say proof, do you mean proof of work, like around the consensus algorithm, or
Validation of the identity.
You're talking about a specific kind of architectural idea. Yeah. It sounds like you're kind of referencing like a state channel-like architecture where you can close things out on, you know, in a guaranteed fashion with a kind of a main chain with something on top of it. And, you know, there are perhaps other things that are interesting are projects that are doing kind of what's like I would describe as a relay machine between different chains with their own consensus algorithms. We were talking about that earlier. I think that's what you're talking about. It sounds like you have of your own kind of unique framing of the blockchain technology. It could be interesting to talk afterwards. Thanks.
I think we have someone here at the second microphone.
Thank you. I don't think I've ever spoken in a room this physically big before. So my name is Henry Kim. I'm from a professor at Trustless School of Business and part of Blockchain Hub at York University. And what I want to ask you is a question that I've been asked many times, both from people like Rubik's and computer science professors, and my background being a technology. What I've heard Marie talk about, that Hyperledger is gone from sort of being a blockchain to a DLT, and R3, Corda has gone from being a blockchain-based solution to a DLT solution. So, you know, when a lot of people looked at blockchain, and especially like Satoshi's paper, what really struck them, and what was really novel and innovative, was proof of work and crypto economics, like the incentive system, right? That was new. Distributed database technology had existed before. Cryptography had existed before. But now what you're saying is that the thing that people like me thought was really novel, which is proof of work and Bitcoin and verification and Bitcoin network, isn't as important for your applications, for the enterprise applications. So my question to you is, sorry, being a professor, I'm always long-winded. My question to you is, what is so different about the world now, right, that the kinds of distributed database technology that had existed for 25 years is now something that is really compelling to use for the world?
I think it's the inevitability of what was proven by the public chains, that ultimately we can have these so-called trustless networks. And what that means is that you know, distributed ledger technology as a first step for enterprises and industry peers does make sense. But it makes sense because, in a sense, I mean, whether it's operating on some subconscious level or something like that, it makes sense because eventually we know that collaboration in the face of competition is an absolute endpoint of the technology.
So let me this is fantastic. So I think what I heard you say is that the way of the business people are thinking about, we need to cooperate with our competitors. We need to collaborate. In this world of business, we can't say we hold our secrets, hold our data secret, and try to keep that from other people. I think that's what I heard you saying. I think it's great.
I would just add, I mean, I think that's part of the case, but I think you're giving too much credit to the broader audience or the media. Most people don't distinguish between a distributed ledger technology and blockchain. They're not making that subtle distinction of what's really happening in consensus and in the ledgers themselves. They're using it as a broad category. But that notion of collaboration, that notion of trust and working across co-opetition, I would call it, is actually a really important point. And we just did an Institute of Business Value study surveying almost 3,000 CXOs, so line of business people in multiple industries, multiple countries, 3,000 of them, and most of them are operating directly with projects on blockchain in some form already. 15% of them are trailblazers, and the 3 lessons learned were iterate really quickly because you don't know what you don't know, and it's not going to be precise, so it'll change, but if you don't get started, you're not going to get there. Work collaboratively, including with your competition. The ones that were in the lead were ones that were working with their competitors, because that's where the differentiation in a new business model will lie. And third, get started, get going.
Tim, do you want to just some final thoughts from Tim?
Yeah, I love that. That's a fantastically leading question, my friend, because it's coming from a place of the core assumption is rooted around Bitcoin and blockchain and what that brought to the economy. You said crypto economics. Now that is, don't get me wrong, that's fascinating, it's important, I think it's going to be a big part of the future state. But what we're really talking about here, and it's actually something I think that is not been really addressed by the academic community yet, and should be addressed, is how do you put academic models around this thing that we're just talking about? It's not really the crypto kind of economics, it's more, I don't know what the term is going to be, ledger economics, like what, there is a new economic model which is rooted around this sort of, this digital model where co-opetition and collaboration actually is the most important element. I think you're right to kind of focus on how we should be thinking about the economics, but the crypto part is a bit of a distraction. And the last thing I'll say is, just to sort of get to this interoperability, where were you all 50 minutes ago, guys, who just walked up? This question about, and this is sort of appealing to both the group who know everything and the group who don't know much. We all now know that there isn't going to be one winner, right? So this religious fervor about whether Bitcoin's better, Fabric's better, Corda's better, Ethereum's better is a bit of a waste of time, because they all need to work together in the end. The ledger net, the future state, which was going to have to stitch them all together. So that's why the interoperability question is so important, right? So we're going to get beyond the religious fervor soon, I think. The maximalism is misplaced in a grown-up world of global economics and business. How do we get this thing to work? Well, we're all going to have to start interoperating. When things are a little bit more evolved and we know that what we're sticking together is going to be around. So
unfortunately, we're going to have to leave it there. I want to thank you all for a great discussion. Hopefully it was
very good.
beneficial to the audience, and thanks for coming out.
Thank you.